Hello comrades, the conservative author and filmmaker Dinesh D'Souza spent all last week promoting his book, The Big Lie, exposing the roots of the American left, in which he claims Nazism and fascism are on the left side of the political spectrum. Of course, in the same week he was promoting his book, Trump-supporting neo-Nazis staged a rally at Charlottesville, Virginia, which ended in violence and the death of a left-wing activist. So, how did D'Souza explain this? Well, he claimed that these Trump-loving neo-Nazis did not realize that the true Nazis were actually left-wing, one of the weakest arguments I have ever heard. So I've decided to go through his moronic claims that he made in a video where he talks about his ridiculous book. Let's begin.
Well, the big lie in this case is that fascism and Nazism are phenomena of the right.
That's odd because both Hitler and Mussolini described their movements as right-wing. For example, in a speech in April 21st, 1921, Hitler declared that if a party of the left was to take power, it would lead to the complete destruction of Germany, to Bolshevism. By contrast, he said that if a party of the right took power, it would be the beginning of a great resistance, which would lead to the victory of the Aryan. He was talking about his own party, of course. As for Mussolini, in the Doctrine of Fascism, he writes that whilst the 19th century was the century of socialism, liberalism and democracy, the 20th century will be a century trending to the right, a fascist century. The fact that fascism and Nazism were on the right of the political spectrum was actually accepted across the board, by conservatives, by communists, by members of the clergy, and the fascists themselves.
From a limited small government conservative, it's amazing how the left has been able, as you call it, use transference to make the right out to be the fascist.
Well, this all began after World War II. Progressives began to dominate the academy, the media, Hollywood. And they actually knew, the early progressives knew, that they were in bed with fascism, with Mussolini in the 20s, with Hitler in the 30s, but they realized how damaging all this would be if it came out.
Was George Orwell, Anthony Eden and Sir Winston Churchill part of this grand conspiracy? Utterly ridiculous. The truth is that National Socialism and fascism were seen as right-wing across the board. Indeed, as Orwell stated in his review of Mein Kampf, Hitler had crushed the labor movement, and for that the property-owning classes were willing to forgive him almost anything. Both left and right concurred in the very shallow notion that National Socialism was merely a version of conservatism. And he was 100% correct. The right saw both Hitler and Mussolini as leaders who protected capitalism and civilization from Eastern Bolshevism.
Fascism into the right-wing column, and they told a new story which has become the conventional wisdom of our time. So blowing that story out of the water, that's my mission in this book.
Well, and it's a big claim, and obviously an honest historian would ascribe progressivism as a cousin of National Socialists and the fascism and all that, but
that might be the dishonest and delusional right-wing perspective, but the fact is that fascists saw an ally in the US political right. For example, General Franco, an ardent fascist, was able to paint himself as a typical right-wing conservative Catholic and US ally during the Cold War. Yes, a man who claimed that Hitler died fighting for Christianity was praised by Republican Richard Nixon as a loyal friend of the United States. Indeed, the American right admired fascism so much that President Reagan declared that most Americans believed that the anti-fascist Abraham Lincoln brigades were fighting on the wrong side of the Spanish Civil War. There was no evidence to support this, but the claim did reveal a lot about Reagan's sympathy for fascism.
The left suppressed the actual ideology of fascism. So, for example, you mentioned that Hitler was a National Socialist, but no one today can see that socialism is actually the economic basis of fascism. Why? Because fascism today has been given sort of new labels. So people will say something like, fascism is about a demagogue who has an authoritarian style.
Because that would be totally inaccurate. As Orwell noted in 1940, the National Socialist regime was largely accepted to be pro-capitalist and anti-labour by both the left and right. Whilst the working class was repressed in the Third Reich, capitalists enjoyed record profits. Indeed, as noted by William Scherner, the author of The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, the share of national income enjoyed by the capitalists massively increased under Hitler, whilst the workers' share declined despite millions having more jobs. It is also worth noting that both Hitler and Mussolini privatized state-owned industries when they came to power, the first leaders in the 20th century to do so. So, nearly every single, if not all, fascist was pro-capitalist. That is a fact of history that cannot be denied.
Why? Because fascism today has been given sort of new labels. So people will say something like, fascism is about a demagogue who has an authoritarian style. First of all, that's not what fascism is at all. There are demagogues who have an authoritarian style all over the world from the beginning of history, and it would be just idiotic to call them fascists. Or people will say fascism is extreme nationalism, as if a kind of patriotic devotion to your country makes you some kind of fascist. Well, obviously, if that were true, Gandhi would be a fascist. Mandela would be a fascist. Castro would be a fascist. Ho Chi Minh would be a fascist. Every anti-colonial leader would be a fascist. So,
the nationalism of Hitler and Mussolini was far different to the nationalism of anti-colonial leaders. The anti-colonial leaders wanted to free their countries from foreign occupation. The fascists, by contrast, believed that their nation had the right to dominate all others. That is aggressive nationalism, usually used by great military powers such as the United States.
And original fascism is the ideology of the centralized state. The leading philosopher of fascism, a guy named Giovanni Gentile, talked about we are the state and the state is us. Now think about it. Does that sound like something that would be chanted at the Republican National Convention or the Democratic National Convention? You see right away the close affinities.
I'm not trying to defend the capitalist Democratic Party, but to say that the Republicans are against a centralized state is an outright lie. They are the party of McCarthyism and the drug war, after all.
Speaking about that too in tactics, one of the other interesting points you make in the book is about the tactics that the left uses to silence its opposition. And you discuss how you never saw anyone violently disrupt a Hillary rally.
Well, this week, Trump-supporting neo-Nazis actually murdered a left-wing protester. Antifa, by contrast, has not murdered anyone. Despite this, we see Trump raving about the old left like a complete lunatic. Now, I was not surprised by this at all. Conservatives have always been the useful idiots of fascism and Nazism. Mussolini knew it, Hitler knew it, Franco knew it, and so do the neo-Nazis who support Trump today. They know that they can rely on conservative useful idiots like Trump to cast the blame somewhere else. Before I go, I would like to mention that Bacdo the Manicist had to create a third channel because his second channel was falsely flagged down. Now, Bacdo is the last person to deserve such treatment. He is not only one of the nicest people in the socialist community, but also has the most talent. If you don't believe me, check his videos out for yourself and you will be pleasantly surprised.